Hello and welcome back to The Perch from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. I'm Noah Zahn, the local government reporter here. This week we're bringing you a story from our crime and public safety reporter, Ivy Secrest. She went up to Casper last week and heard about the fire situation in Wyoming over the past year, which has been the worst it's been in what sounds like about 40 years, and what the state and fire wardens across the state are doing to support that in the coming year. But before we get to that, we'll bring you a quick local news roundup. I'm joined here by Hannah Shields, our state government reporter. What's been going on with you?
So, over the weekend, legislative leadership nominees, technically, until they're officially sworn in next month, dropped the committee assignments that we'd all been waiting for, which will determine the new structure of the committees heading into the 68th legislature, which will be sworn in next year. There was a little bit of a hubbub with the committee assignments. One was released Saturday, kind of maybe around midday, and a second one was released a couple of hours later. And after talking with lawmakers, it turned out that both of those lists were wrong. So I was able to get in touch with the new incoming House Speaker, Representative Chip Nyman, who took 100% of the responsibility for it, telling me that there was just basically a bit of a miscommunication between him and an LSO staff member. But a third release was released on Sunday, and that kind of had the finalized guaranteed list of the committee structures. So moving forward from that, there were definitely some pretty big noticeable changes, especially regarding Cheyenne local lawmakers going into these new committee assignments. So I will start off with the Joint Appropriations Committee. Joint meaning it is both the Senate committee and House committee coming together. Appropriations is one of the most influential committees in the legislature in the sense that it's the only one that makes recommendations to the governing body about the state's budget. They have like that first go out when it comes to the state's purse strings. They have a lot of influence over the bills that come through. So Representative Bob Nicholas, who is here from Cheyenne, has been on that committee for 12 years and was chairman on the House side for 8 of them. In this new committee, however, he will no longer be serving on it. He will be replaced by Representative John Baer, a member of the Wyoming Freedom Caucus, as chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. But Nicholas was not only replaced as chair, but was also completely removed from it. When I was able to talk to him yesterday, he told me this was something he expected, telling me that, quote, it's a different branch of the Republican Party. They kind of made it pretty clear that if they took over the majority, they would rearrange all the committees, end quote. Senator Tara Nethercott, who had also served on the Senate Appropriations Committee in the upper chamber, was on it for 2 years, had chaired it for a single year. She was also removed from that committee as well and put on the minerals. So that's kind of like one big thing. Another thing is Representative Dan Swanitzer had been the chair of the Labor Committee in 2023 and 2024. That spot did open up when he lost his re-election campaign in the August Republican primary. He will now be replaced by the current Wyoming Freedom Caucus chairwoman, Representative Rachel Rodriguez-Williams from Cody. And his replacement is going to be definitely a huge turnaround just in regards of political views. Swanitzer was definitely more moderate. Under him, the Joint Labor Committee temporarily extended Medicaid coverage for qualified pregnant women 12 months postpartum, amended eligibility requirements for a cancer prevention program, and offered up to 24 hours of paid leave for state employees to volunteer as a firefighter. When I asked Rodriguez-Williams what her new goals were as for the new role, she gave me, like a basic statement, basically saying that she plans to work hard with the Labor Committee, but she also told me that she is going to be focusing on pro-life, pushing that agenda, and supporting mothers. Another pretty big thing to note is that for the first time in more than 20 years, there will be no Democratic voices on the legislature's Joint Education Committee. Up until recently, we had at least one Democratic lawmaker from each chamber serving on that committee. That would be Representative Carly Provenza on the House side, and Senator Chris Rothfuss on the Senate side. Both of them are from Laramie. Senator Rothfuss is a current professor over at the University of Wyoming. This bit of news definitely created a lot of stir in the Democratic Party, who sent out a release on Saturday night, very much criticizing this move. In the press release, Carly Provenza had stated, quote, "Our schools are the heart of Wyoming's communities. Wyoming schools face challenges like teacher shortages, declining enrollment, increases in student mental health issues, and rural school funding," end quote. When I asked the incoming House Speaker, Representative Nyman, who's also a member of the Freedom Caucus, about this move, he had told me that he wasn't even aware that the Senate President nominee, who is Bo Byman from Manchester, had also taken Rothfuss off the committee in the upper chamber. Going into why he removed Provenza from the committee, he told me, quote, "There was no specific reason. I had a responsibility to fill so many spots based on the percentage of them in the body," end quote, meaning the Democrats. I spoke with Minority Floor Leader Representative Mike Yen, who's a Democrat from Jackson, on his perspective on it. He told me that he had several conversations with Nyman and current House Speaker Albert Summers about the committee assignments. He told me he was sure that the Senate Democrats had those same conversations with leadership as well. But he told me that the ultimate question was, what is the reason for taking a Democrat off the committee? And he speculated that it could have to do with charter schools and privatizing education, which he said is an issue that Democrats have been staunchly opposed to and Republicans are kind of split on. So when it comes to that final deciding vote and Democrats have that influence, he speculated maybe they just didn't want that influence there. So, I mean, those were definitely some big takeaways coming out of these committees.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate you bringing us the latest on that.
Yeah, no, that's all for me. But what's going on in your beat?
So not a whole lot. There's one item on City Council that City Council discussed this week. I think I talked about it a week or two ago, maybe on the podcast, but they made an official decision on the oversized vehicle parking ban in Cheyenne. So what they decided is that oversized vehicles will not be able to park on public roadways in Cheyenne. They made a few amendments to it. That ban will only be in effect for, it will not be in effect for the summer months. So basically Memorial Day through Labor Day, but the rest of the year, owners of those vehicles will have to file for a permit to park their vehicle. And I think those permits are for 5 days at a time. So whenever they have to prep their vehicle to go on a camping trip or whatever. And this isn't just recreational vehicles. This is other oversized vehicles, maybe some trailers or especially large trucks. Those would not be in compliance. It's up to 8.5 feet wide for the vehicles that would be banned. So that's most normal sized vehicles, I suppose, would fit under that. And they also made an amendment to it, to the ordinance that bars any vehicle from parking on any part of the sidewalk or travel lane for longer than 8 hours. So that's just been a hot topic that a lot of people have been showing up to public meetings, speaking for it or against it. But that's all for me. So now we're going to head over to Ivy to hear from her. Now I'm here with Ivy Secrest, our crime and public safety reporter. And last week you went up to Casper and you met with some fire chiefs to chat with them about Wyoming's fire season over the past year. Can you tell me a bit about what you heard there?
This past Thursday, I went to the Wyoming Rural Fire and Wyo Fire Chiefs Association joint meeting at the 64th Annual Wyoming Rural Firefighters Association. And it was really interesting because Wyoming has had a really tough fire season. It has been one of the more aggressive fire seasons that they've had since roughly the 80s. There's been over 2,000 reports of fires as of mid-November. The elk fire comes to mind. We, as a community, have really seen the impact of wildfires. And so a big part of this meeting is different fire chiefs from different counties coming in, different fire wardens from different counties coming in and talking about what their counties are experiencing, what their counties need. And notably, there was an update on the Wyoming State Forestry Division from Forester Kelly Norris. And she really illustrated the strength and the struggles that firefighters in the state have been facing in this past year, whether that's from a lack of funding, needing to deplete funds that they typically use to take care of this fire season, and really looking forward to this upcoming legislative session to rehabilitate those funds and get themselves back in a comfortable place to face the next fire season.
What are some of those legislative items that they've got their eye on?
Well, one of the most important things is funding. So Governor Gordon actually, in his message for the supplemental budget, discussed how Wyoming has, as we've already discussed, had this insane fire season that depleted emergency fire suppression account funds, or the EFSA. It also dipped into Wyoming Office of Homeland Security contingency account funds, and honestly, it was just an incredibly expensive fire season. So they're really looking to rehabilitate those funds. According to Norris, they were responsible for about $55 million in EFSA fire costs, so they're looking to re-up that. But yeah, so Forester Kelly Norris reiterated kind of Gordon's message of it's essential to refill all of these emergency and contingency accounts to enable a timely response to fires that could be happening in the coming year. Gordon really pointed to increased fire seasons that we're seeing in neighboring states of Colorado and Montana and California and even up in Canada. And he is taking that kind of as a precursor to really prepare for potentially more intense fire seasons than Wyoming is used to seeing.
So if they get this additional funding, is that what it is they're seeking?
It's not additional funding. Okay. It's refilling funding that they already had. So when you're addressing over 2,000 fires, it costs a lot of money. A lot of these guys are volunteers. There's only 40-something employees, like full-time employees at the State Forestry Division. Mm-hmm. So they're spread quite thin. And basically, these EFSA funds are used to suppress fires. So after the fire is going, these funds are used to, bring it back. They're not necessarily like preventative management funds. And so they need those to respond to fires in the future, and they've completely depleted their accounts, or at least they've severely depleted their accounts. So Governor Gordon and the fire service and the entire Wyoming fire community are looking to re-up these funds.
I was just going to ask, do you know, are these funds completely depleted every year? Is that the norm for Wyoming, or is it? Okay.
It's not the norm for Wyoming. This was, like we said, an above average fire season. They haven't really seen this many fires in Wyoming since around the 80s was what people kept saying at the conference. And typically, they do have funds rolling over from the previous year into the next year to use. But they are incredibly organized. So they set aside personal funding from their association to lobby in the upcoming legislature. So a few things that they're lobbying for besides refilling these contingency accounts is for the forest health bill. So one of the bills coming up in front of the legislature this session will be a draft bill titled Forest Health Grant Program 3, which would create a grant program through the Wyoming State Forestry Division that would be able to fund up to 75% of a forest health project. And so forest health is like removing fuels from the forest grounds, or trimming back foliage, or logging. There's a whole slew of things that kind of fall into this area of forest health. And the idea is if you maintain the forest, you decrease the risk of wildfires. And that looks different for each landscape, and they turn to subject area experts for that. But if this bill were to pass, then the Wyoming State Forestry Division would be able to give these local groups funds to take care of this preventatively, as opposed to these suppression account funds. Obviously, both would still be necessary, but this would definitely help in the area of fuels, which they're quite concerned about. That's really the only bill that they're looking to support. The other bills that they have issues with are one bill that's received a decent amount of attention recently, which is a utilities protection bill, the Public Utilities Wildfire Protection Plans and Liability Measure that, would incentivize power companies to mitigate the risks of wildfire in exchange for damage claim limits. And that's fine and dandy, but their concern from the wildfire fighter perspective is that the bill has minor mitigation requirements as opposed to major mitigation requirements, so that companies would have to take pretty minor steps to receive this decrease in liability. And what the Firefighters Association is looking for is to have a major mitigation requirement as opposed to minor.
So they're advocating for something a bit stronger.
Right.
Yeah. Are there any other bills that they were opposed to?
They went over several bills. There are also wildfire property tax exemptions, and this draft bill would introduce property tax exemptions for landowners who were affected by wildfires in the past year. And one of the major concerns with that is that these local firefighting divisions would be potentially losing funds to suppress fires. So they use a lot of tax funds to respond to these fires in the first place. And so if we're cutting property taxes in areas where fires are happening, they do have some concerns about that. Their issue isn't necessarily with people getting a tax break. You could imagine if you are working in ag and your property is affected by a wildfire, you might not have the income to pay the typical property taxes, and that is quite a noble pursuit. But what they want as an amendment is for the legislature to backfill local taxes for fire response capabilities, ensuring that the tax exemptions don't limit their ability to provide services. Another issue that they're concerned with is single stair exits, and this one I think is quite interesting. So we all know that housing is an issue and affordable housing is a problem, and one of the ways in which cities are looking to address that is to build multifamily units smaller and quicker than they normally would. And of course, fire code comes into building any sort of multifamily unit. And one of the bills in front of the legislature that is in line with a nationwide trend is to allow single exits in specified multifamily dwellings, particularly multifamily dwellings under 6 stories. So that means if you have an apartment building 6 stories tall, the building company could technically only have one exit or one stairway instead of 2. That becomes a safety issue pretty quickly. There are already ways to get specific zoning for that type of building. And the concern from the fire community is there's already a route to get there. Why would we take away the power of fire safety and code? So in that one, they're looking for some negotiation, trying to lower the number of stories. But they are just strongly opposed to the draft bill.
And so when you were there in Casper, I'm curious, what was the attitude there? Were most people sort of optimistic going to this next year that they'll receive a lot of those funds and that they'll, get those amendments to the legislation, the potential legislation that might pass? Or was there a bit of concern going into the next year? Did you hear much about that?
So these guys are safety oriented first and foremost. Everything that they talked about was aimed at how do we do our job safely? How do we communicate to legislators why we need to do our jobs the way we do them? How do we explain, the budget aspect of responding to a natural disaster? And as Wyoming Fire Advisory Board President Shad Cooper put it during the meeting, when they have backed these bills, when they have explained things to legislature, when they have been really clear on the safety aspects of their jobs, they normally get what they want in the legislature. They normally get that type of cooperation. So they were pretty optimistic that if they go forward and they talk to members of the legislature, that they can get these amendments that they want, because they're not necessarily coming at it. While there are political aspects to being a firefighter, they're not coming at it from a political standpoint. So they do have this negotiating power of, hey, there's a safety reason that we have this, or hey, the reason that we can't put forward a solid budget for you guys is because we're all collaborating and we all do help each other out. And that means sometimes my funds go over here and their funds come over this way. So they were quite optimistic. They were quite safety oriented, and they were all very comfortable putting forward funds to pay for members of their community to go down and lobby, put together a white paper, and explain exactly why they need what they need. So yeah, they're quite optimistic.
Yeah, and I guess next steps for them, just wait until January for the budget session to start and kicking into gear on some of those lobbying efforts.
Yeah, they will have one more meeting between all of them in January prior to the legislative session. But yeah, next steps for them are pretty much just make sure that they're all on the same page with how they feel about these bills, that they're all communicating the same information, and that they're prepared to lobby come the session.
Great. Anything else that our listeners should know about this story?
No, I think that's all.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Ivy. Appreciate that. And if you want to learn more, you can check out her story online or in print. But that's all for this week from the Perch at the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. Thank you to Hannah Shields and Ivy Secrest for contributing to this week's episode. And be sure to tune back in next Wednesday for more.